You see, when Newton discovered his law, he didn't say, well, I don't need God anymore, I've got a law. That's what Hawking's saying. No, he said, what a brilliant God it is who did it that way. The more he understood of how the universe worked, the more he admired the God who'd done it that way. And of course that's true of many areas of life, isn't it? The more you know of engineering, the more you can admire a Rolls-Royce engine. The more you know of painting, the more you can admire a Rembrandt. And so the more Newton understood, the more he admired the God that did it that way, and he put that into his famous book, the most famous in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica, expressing explicitly the desire that people reading it might come to believe in a deity. So what we're talking about here, all the time actually, is the nature of explanation. The nature of explanation. What do we mean when we say science explains? Think of the law of gravity again, since we're talking about it. What does the law of gravity explain? Well, the one thing it doesn't explain is gravity, of course. Nobody knows what gravity is. Do you know, I wish I'd been taught that at school. I thought the law of gravity told us what gravity was, but it doesn't. Now, don't misunderstand me, it's brilliant. Mathematics is the art of compressibility, and you think an equation with 8 symbols in it can be used to do mathematical calculations that will tell you what the ellipses of the planets are around the sun, will even enable you to land a person on the moon without Einstein's corrections. It's brilliant insight, staggering intellectual achievement. But Newton realized it didn't tell him what gravity was. And it was Wittgenstein who put it best of all, I think. He said the greatest deception of modernism is the idea that the laws of nature explain the world to us, when all they do is describe structural regularities. So even at its own level, you have to be extremely careful with the statement science explains, because you're only getting a one-level explanation usually, and not a complete explanation. Simple example, of course, is why is the kettle boiling? Well, because the heat energy is agitating the molecules of water, and they're beginning to spit off, and steam pressure is building up, and so on and so forth. No, it isn't. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. Now, we laugh at that in its simplicity, but this is a profound thing, because you can immediately see, I hope, that those two explanations do not conflict, they don't compete, they complement. But they're different kinds of explanation. The first one is a scientific explanation in terms of laws and mechanisms. The second is an agent mechanism. And you see, I want to submit to you that God no more competes with science as an explanation than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car engine. And what is being suggested to you by many of these people is precisely that. You're being asked to choose between Henry Ford and internal combustion. You'd never dream of doing it. And interestingly enough, I find kids at school often can understand it better than professors. They see the difference in the different level of explanation. Now, of course, once you start on that line, you meet objections. And there are two principal ones coming, not surprisingly, from Richard Dawkins and now from many other people. I met at least one of them last time I was in a town hall here debating Peter Singer in Melbourne. If you believe that God created the universe, you'll have to ask who created God. And then you'll have to say who created the creator that created, and so on forever. And that's nonsense, so it would be better to go back to doing something serious like playing Australian rules football. But just a moment. A little bit of logic will soon deal with that. If you ask who created God, that is a sentence of the type, who or what created X? It assumes, of course, obviously, that X was created. So if you ask who created God, you're assuming God was created. But what if he wasn't? Then the question simply doesn't apply. It only works with created gods. The biblical God is that he is eternal. He wasn't created. So instead of dealing with the question of God, the question bypasses it completely. Now, there are several additional points to be made. The first is this. Since the question applies to created gods, I turned it round on Richard Dawkins. And I said to him, you believe the universe created you. And you believe your question is valid, so let me ask it. Who created your creator? I'm still waiting for an answer, and it's 8 years ago I asked the question. You see, what this is really about philosophically is there an ultimate reality? And what I find is that with most of my atheist friends, the questioning stops. The questions don't go back forever. They come to a full stop with the universe, the multiverse, or mass energy. That's the ultimate explicator of everything. For a Christian like me, of course, the ultimate is God. So the question to be decided is not, is there an ultimate reality, but which reality is ultimate? Now, probing a little bit more in this direction, Richard has a related question. He said, look, let's look at this a different way. If you postulate that God created the universe, then by definition, God is more complex than the thing you're explaining. So he can't be an explanation at all. Because explanation, by definition, moves from the simple to the complex. Now, we're probably very familiar with this. It's called reductionism. Turning it upside down, the idea is that you get simpler and simpler explanations for bits of a thing from the bottom up. You reduce everything, in other words, to physics and chemistry. And the trouble is, we're often told at school and university that that is the nature of scientific explanation. Well, it is for a lot of scientific explanation, but it's not for everything. And there's one vastly important exception, which I can illustrate with Richard Dawkins again. His book, The God Delusion, is quite complex. It's got about 400 pages in it. So I ask, of course, what is the origin of this text? And somebody suggests to me it originated in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. So I reject that explanation, since it's more complex than the thing you're explaining. You see, it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because the thing we're talking about is a linguistic phenomenon. It has a language dimension. Now, this fascinates me. And of course, it's true to our experience. You imagine, I go to China, and I'm taken into a cave by a Chinese archaeologist, and there are all kinds of scratches on it. And as he walks through a cage, I see a very simple scratch. One goes down to the left like that, and from the middle, there comes to the right like that. And I need to be careful because I've got a Mandarin speaker right over here watching me. And as the Chinese archaeologist comes, he says, human intelligence. And I say, what do you mean, human intelligence? Those two scratches. I said, don't be ridiculous. They're only two scratches. And you're postulating something as complex as a human intelligence to account for them. And she looks at me from a great intellectual height. And she says, you've obviously never learned any Chinese. Because that, of course, is a symbol for a human being, run. And the only thing that can account for those two scratches is human intelligence. Fascinating, isn't it? You see your name written on Bondi Beach, and you'll immediately postulate intelligence. Now the fun starts. In a moment of magic, this Chinese archaeologist turns into an Oxford molecular biologist. And she takes me into her laboratory and shows me down a stereoscopic microscope that has not yet been invented, as you'll see in a moment. So as I look through this microscope, I see letters spitting off a long chain, C, G, A, G, C, T, A, A, G, T, C, A, A. And I say with my big wondering Irish eyes, what is that? Oh, she says, don't you know what that is? That's the human genome. These things are codons. Oh, I said, codons, they code for something, certainly. They have a semiotic dimension. They code for the proteins. And I say, look, this seems to be immensely long. Yes, he says, there are actually 3.5 billion of them. But I said, is the order important? You see, oh yes, he said, it's like a computer program, you see. And what's the origin of that, I say? And she says, chance and the laws of nature. I say, pardon? 3 seconds ago, we were in a cave in China. You saw 2 scratches. And you said because they had, if I understood you correctly, because they have a semiotic dimension, they demand human intelligence. Something odd is happening, ladies and gentlemen. When we see word, and we've come to the situation where we've discovered that the longest word we've ever discovered is in each one of the 10 trillion cells of our body. And when we see the tiniest words anywhere, in every case, without exception, except here, we ascribe it to intelligence. Why the double think? Well, it's obvious, of course. Because if you once introduce the idea of intelligence behind DNA, you will not escape the Godic question. Oh, but you say this is intelligence of the gaps. No, it isn't. You would never, as you look at those words there, City Bible Forum, you immediately see an intelligence has been responsible for that. You wouldn't let me away with the idea, don't be silly. You're postulating an intelligence of the gaps. Of course you're not. What you're doing is saying, you instantly perceive, even though you may never have articulated it like that physics and chemistry is powerless to explain the semiotic dimension of the way in which those words convey meaning to your mind. And so you postulate an intelligence. I simply want to apply the same argument to the longest word we have ever seen. Now this leads me to the last major point. It began, oddly enough, with Darwin. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? That argument is now mainstream in the philosophical world because leading thinkers like Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist, by the way, in America, says we have done a lot of good science by thinking, but what we haven't done is think about thinking. Because the moment you begin to think about thinking, you have to come to this basic scientific credo. Why do I trust my mind? I often talk to my atheist colleagues. In fact, I do it all the time. So I say, you know, you're doing science with your mind. What is the mind? Well, it's the brain. Oh, what's the brain? Well, the short story is, it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, I said, and you trust it. You wouldn't dream of trusting your computer if you knew it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Now, this is being treated very seriously. Google Thomas Nagel and his book with the explosive title, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the Universe is Almost Certainly False. To me, that the cosmic chemistry of atheism and science doesn't work for the simple reason that when it comes to dealing with our human rationality on which we depend to do science, atheism doesn't simply shoot itself in the foot. That's painful. It shoots itself in the brain, which is fatal. Thank you very much.